Just a lighthearted discussion this time. It's only about the definition of art and also the definition of life. So, nothing too serious. Um, so, I was thinking about this whilst reading some media that I will not give details about. But suffice it to say, there was a scene that was very, bittersweet because it was a very sweet moment between these two characters, but at the same time, it was beset on all sides by personal problems, societal problems, it's in the middle of a war, etc., etc. So it was like very thwarted, but at the same time, very touching. And it got me thinking about that sort of phenomenon by which things stand out from their limitations and at a certain point become uh, stand out from their limitations because of their limitations and kind of transcend. And to me, that's a cornerstone of my theology and the way that I view Christianity, the way that I view the incarnation and the cross and all of that. But I think it also is a good way to look at art, like what defines art. And of course, this is more of a spectrum than a strict definition. But so you know how there's limitations in this world, and everything is defined. So defined as in like border and finish and end. Um, in order for something to exist at all, it exists through all of these limitations and imperfections and thwartings of the fullness of things and highlighting and hiding, like I've discussed from Gestalt psychology. If something is one thing, then that means that it is not all of these other things. And we see this all around us in the world. Thwartings and limitations and borders and edges. Um, the fact that you may feel so many things so richly, but you can only put it into words inadequately. Two people may want to love each other and to communicate, but their personal foibles and hang-ups and things that have been put into them from being kids cause things to be rough. The existence of death as we experience it in the first place, and the fact that there's infinite potential in everybody's life, but it gets cut off at a certain point. I think the end of childhood for a lot of people is that kind of thing. Yeah. And you could also think of limit or definition or borders as form, because that's what a form is the edge that delineates something from the surroundings. And as you move toward like art, in the to the extent that art is a separate thing from other kinds of things, I think a lot of what defines it is that as you move into the art area way of existence, instead of the form into which, let's say, the reality, capital R, or like transcendence, or like the message, or the spirit of the thing, all of that is kind of being channeled through this form, right? Or being expressed in a limited way necessarily, because that's the only way that anything. So instead of that form and that definition and those limitations limiting limiting reality and limiting that which is kind of trying to be passed through them, there's this kind of reversing and this movement by which the limitation, well, in terms of art, the form is the medium is the message, and the form is the message, and the message is the form, and they're inextricable one from the other. And so, in a practical sense, in terms of, say, poetry, the way that this manifests is that one of the things that at least I would use to call something poetic is the more poetic it is, the more it's true that you can't put it in any other words without really losing the essence of it. It says what it says, and it's self-sufficient. And it's not that those words are simply necessarily limited approximations of some greater idea. The form is that which is being said. And so, on a more in a more metaphysical sense, what's happening is that that form kind of becomes glorified, becomes perfected, kind of lights a flame in a sense, and becomes a vessel for transcendence, and it's a kind of conquering death by death kind of thing. I think that movement to me is very much connected with the way that I think of Christian theology, of going into limitation in order to transcend limitation. And a limitation, a definition of form that by fully embracing itself and leaning into what it is, then, transcends itself and goes beyond itself, but only by virtue of being itself very particularly. And so again, and that's a very general principle, but in art we see it as people will tell you, focus on the details. If you want to talk about war, don't talk about the big sweep of the war, talk about a kid's socks left on the side of the road. If you wanted to express a, long-term, very deep, loving relationship, don't use grand, big terms that try to gesture at this big, vague idea, the capital I. Talk about like the little details and the little inside jokes and the little private language, and that's where the power of it is. And that reminds me, when I was thinking about that reminds me of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem. His poems don't have titles, but it's as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. It's the one that starts with that. Actually, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Selves goes itself. Hold up. I skipped a part. I know this. Okay. Dragonflies draw flame. Ah. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As saying it wrong. Speaking of the form being misaligned with the message, the way that I deliver the poem. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbling over rim of, in, roundy wells, stones ring, as each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung, finds tongue to fling out broad its name, each mortal thing does one thing and the same, selves goes itself. Myself it sings and spells, crying, what I do is me, for this I came. And that's the first half of the poem, but so we've said that, art is defined that way, and the kind of, transcendent and beautiful quality of art is that resonance between the form and the message, or the spirit, or the reality of the thing, by which that form kind of comes alight and becomes necessary and becomes glorified in a sense. If you think of limitations as, you might think of them as, well, as bad and as precisely limiting, but then as you move into, what art does is makes them, I don't know, necessary and beautiful. And it's kind of the same principle with life, isn't it? Another one of those big concepts that's very hard to define. But I think looking at it this way and thinking about that poem, he's basically saying the same thing as I was just saying about art. He's saying it about mortal things and living things. Even that mortal thing being something that's subject to death, which is the way that we indicate things that are alive. So there you have it. He's saying that a living thing, what it does with the way of it, with the form of it, is simply kind of speaking its own name and expressing its own name and expressing itself through every movement of it, through every, the shape of it in space and time. And I mean, even like looking at the materialism of it, we know this. I mean, you have entropy, you have chaos and like entropy, and you have certain patterns of order building up within that and holding it at bay for a bit. And when you have a living creature, you have all of these necessities and all of these, all these patterns and all these needs and all these systems within the body that are held in this delicate balance, and 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 that system, which is made of limitations and survival mechanisms and need, it it makes the living thing what it is. And that connection makes sense because, I don't know, a lot of people speak about art as like having this magical quality to it or having a life to it, and kind of a life in itself to it. And a something more. And that's kind of what defines things that we consider art and things that we consider living, is that something more that is not separate from and that's not in spite of the form in which it is manifest to the world, but it's through that form in every little imperfect detail of it. And now if we want to bring Christianity, or at least my theology, into it, Christ would be the kind of the way by which this happens, the way by which, is this process theology? I don't know what process theology is. It might be. But in this kind of scheme, I would think of Christ, or you could even say, I think you could say spirit as well, or the way or something. But I would think of Christ as the kind of through line of that, and the animating force, and the way by which this happens, the way by which, I don't know, spirit and matter and message and form and body and soul, spirit are held together. And the way by which death is conquered by death, the way by which, that is to say, limitations are transcended through limitations. Not one individual up on a pedestal somewhere, and not something that even has one name, but I don't know, the way by which any name is fitted to its referent. And Hopkins does continue in that vein as well. So I will finish out and I will just quote the entire poem if I can remember it. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame, as tumbling over rim of, is it of or in? As tumbling over rim in roundy wells stones ring, as each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to ring out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. So even he's talking about animals, then he's talking about art, and he's talking about humans. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for this I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that makes all his goings graces, acts in God's sight what in God's sight he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 1,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces.